John Brown moved to Chicago in 1938 and purchased a modest piece of land that was already set up to raise chickens. Growing up in the Great Depression made John know that working hard and being humble was the best way to live. That was part of what attracted Belva to him, and soon after the two wed in 1943, living simply in a small section of the farm's chicken coop. To be fair, chickens were a big part of the farm, so it was likely a much larger coop than you probably initially imagined. But they eventually started a family and needed more space, so they built a home on the property in 1948 and went on to have 4 children. With the additional mouths to feed, they started needing more income, so they sold Belva's piano and bought a small trailer that they turned into a concession stand right at the edge of their property. And what would be better to serve on a chicken farm than hot, tasty fried chicken? The chickens were taken straight from the farm and butchered right there for the day's orders. Not only did that make the fried chicken as fresh as it could be, it made them able to sell it at a low price. High-quality food at an affordable price made the fried chicken stand a huge success, and over the next few years, the Brown family farm was the place to go for dinner. That was until the health department got wind of their operation and shut them down in 1951. Fortunately, the popularity of the food made it possible for John to find a piece of property in Bridgeview just southwest of downtown Chicago. There he was able to build a restaurant complete with a restroom and running water like the health department required, plus a new home for the family to live in. The operation of the restaurant included the whole family. John and Belva ran the restaurant, and the kids would prep the food and clean up. You could get fried chicken, a slice of white bread, and a serving of coleslaw for a whopping 69 cents. That location did just as well as the trailer, and soon they opened a second location. The second Brown's Chicken opened in Elmhurst to the north in 1958. When that proved successful, they began franchising, opening new locations all over the Chicago area and even a few in other states. By 1987, there were more than 100 locations, and the company was pulling in more than $70 million in annual sales. The restaurant's success would not save John and Belva's relationship, and after arguments and accusations of infidelity, they divorced in 1969. Belva traded all of her shares of the company to keep the Bridgewater location and run it herself. By the 1990s, John had moved away from running the restaurants and was living in Florida. He opened a few franchises there but was mostly retired. He lived there alone as his children didn't have the best relationship with him, and that was part of the reason he decided to end his own life on December 30th, 1992. It was a major tragedy for Brown's Chicken. What had started from humble beginnings had ended with divorce, estrangement, and death. Unfortunately, John's death would be overshadowed just 9 days later when an even bigger tragedy happened at the Brown's Chicken franchise in Palatine, Illinois. This is Monsters. Juan Luna was born on February 16, 1974 in Zacatecas, Mexico to Juan Sr. and Alicia Luna. It's a mid-sized city in central Mexico that's known for mining. He had a brother Jorge and a sister Brenda by 1979 when he and his family immigrated to the United States. They ended up in the Chicago area where they had one more child, a daughter named Eliza. Juan adapted to life in the U.S., attending William Friend High School in Palatine and hanging out with his friends. Once he graduated, he stayed in the U.S. for less than a year, working minimum wage jobs like a local pie restaurant and a popular fried chicken joint. It was sometime in 1993, though, that he chose to move back to Mexico. He lived in his hometown where he met a woman named Imelda, and soon the couple married. They moved back to the Chicago area, where Juan got his citizenship in 1995. In 1997, Juan and Imelda welcomed a son to their family. The Lunas settled into a typical life in the suburbs of Chicago. Juan worked for Golgren Appliance as an installer. He worked 6 days a week, making $11 an hour, which would be more than $30 today, so he was making decent money. People around him said he was a devoted father and husband, always helping out as much as he could with the duties of raising a young boy. By the early 2000s, he was living a stable life with a good job and what looked like a bright future for his family. James Degorski, who went by Jim, was born on August 20th, 1972 in Chicago, Illinois, to William and Pat Degorski. He had a large family that included one older sister, Kathy, 2 younger brothers, Brian and Kevin, and a younger sister, Megan. That was likely because people claimed that William was sex-crazed. He was never satisfied with the amount of sex he got from his wife, which he would end up physically abusing her over. Then he would openly masturbate in front of his children, encouraging his sons to do the same. He was also a Vietnam veteran who was diagnosed with schizophrenia, a volatile combination that caused him to have frequent nightmares. His constant violent outbursts made it hard for him to keep a job. Pat coped with the situation in their family by eating. It seemed that she thought she could stop William from hurting her if she became too heavy to throw around. Because of that, she gained enough weight to cause diabetes and hypertension. She eventually became paranoid that William would try to poison her, so she only made meals that were prepared in one big dish. She believed that her husband wouldn't harm the children, so the food was safe as long as they were all eating from one dish. In 1989, when Jim would have been about 16, Pat accused her husband of sexually abusing one of their daughters. He admitted to it, but blamed it on his past trauma, which was a combination of being a Vietnam vet, being adopted, and also having been sexually abused by a priest when he was a boy. She ended up getting a protective order for her daughter and kicking him out of the house, but he would return when the kids were gone and leave little clues so they knew he was still watching them. Creepy. Jim attended the same high school as Juan, and despite him being 2 years older, he failed enough classes that he stayed in school longer. He eventually got his GED in 1994 and entered the workforce, not picky about the type of work. During that time, he tended to do some form of manual labor, and eventually he learned enough skills to start his own handyman business. He eventually purchased a house in Wakanda, which is just north of Palatine, not a hidden country in Africa. He moved into that house with his girlfriend, Jennifer Peters. Jennifer was a teacher, and when she decided to move to Arizona for the warmer weather and better job prospects, Jim shut down his business and went with her. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to drum up enough work and moved back north. Not to the Chicago area, but he moved in with his brother Kevin, who was living in Indianapolis, Indiana by then. Jim started working in apartment maintenance where he met a man named Walter Hanger. Walter was a devout Baptist and talked to Jim about his faith quite a bit. It was in the early 2000s that Jim asked Walter a simple question. Could someone go to heaven if they had killed someone? Back in 1992, Jim and Juan had met in a vocational program in their high school. They were both wannabe tough guys, but Jim definitely had more of a violent streak. He had been dating a fellow student named Kristen Lundstrom for a while, and their relationship included regular beatings from Jim. After about a year of abuse, she wrote a letter to Jim breaking up with him. Jim caught her after she left work one afternoon and begged her to talk, which turned into an argument. While sitting in her parked car, Jim began punching Kristen in the face. When she tried to flee the car, he reached over and pulled the door closed, slamming it into her legs. He eventually got her out of the car, taped her wrists and ankles together, and put her in the trunk. Then he drove off in her car. He went to a motel where he paid for a room, took Kristen inside, and continued to beg her to stay together with him. Because if anything shows you really care about someone, it's gotta be kidnap and assault. Am I right, ladies? Knowing she needed to tell him whatever he wanted to hear, she agreed to stay with him, and he ended up letting her go. Not without threatening to kill her if she reported him, though. Still, she told her parents what had happened and they went to the police the next day. Jim eventually pleaded guilty to misdemeanor battery, and it seems as though he only got probation. Even though he wasn't locked up, he did leave Kristen alone after that. It wasn't long before Jim had forgotten about Kristen because he had moved on with someone else. Like Jim, Ann Lockett didn't grow up in a stable home. Her father had become chronically ill and self-medicated with alcohol. That led to him becoming abusive, which pushed her to stay out of the house as much as she could. She started using drugs as an escape, and it was in that world that she met Jim. Another outcast from a broken home, the two could relate to each other. They began dating in the middle of 1992, and Jim didn't treat her any better than he had treated Kristen. By the start of the new year, Ann was so depressed that she swallowed a handful of NyQuil in an attempt to end her life. Luckily, it didn't work, and after having her stomach pumped, she was admitted to a psychiatric facility in the area. It was January 9th, 1993 when she got all checked in and soon received a call at the nurse's station. It was Jim, and I guess the facility didn't screen calls because letting her talk to her abusive boyfriend doesn't seem like the best way to encourage her recovery. Either way, all Jim wanted to do was brag and told her to watch the news that night, stating, quote, "We did something big." That wasn't really an option for Ann, though, as many recovery facilities restrict access to the outside world. Outside distractions are limited so the patients can focus on themselves. Ann called her mother and asked her to bring a newspaper the next time she visited. It was only then that Ann learned exactly what Jim had done. Dick and Lynn Ehlenfeld had met and married in Wisconsin and had moved to South Dakota when Dick worked in politics. Once he grew tired of that, he got a job in the Chicago area and they moved there with their 3 daughters, Jennifer, Dana, and Joyce. When he was laid off from that company a few years later, he started looking into the restaurant industry. Not wanting to open a restaurant from scratch, he started researching franchise opportunities and found a Brown's Chicken franchise in Palatine whose owner was interested in selling. They used their entire life savings, and in May of 1992 they purchased the franchise. They went through a training program provided by the Brown's Chicken corporate owners, and they did a little remodeling. They put in long hours turning the underperforming location around, and with a staff of mostly young high schoolers, they were on their way to making a nice living with the operation. On January 8, 1993, Jim and Juan parked north of the Brown's Chicken and walked through the snow to the restaurant. With them, they had a snub-nosed .38 caliber revolver that Jim had purchased from a friend, as well as a knife. First, they went to the back of the building and jammed a wooden wedge into the door so it wouldn't be able to be opened from the inside. Juan had previously worked at the restaurant, so he knew the layout inside, even in the back areas where customers weren't allowed. After they entered the building, Juan stepped up to the counter and ordered a 4-piece chicken meal. As he paid, Lynn said hi to him, recognizing him as a former employee. He took his food and sat down at a booth with Jim. As he took a bite from a chicken leg, Jim asked him what the hell he was doing. After that, Juan tossed the meal in the trash and they both went into the restroom. They put on gloves and readied their weapons before storming back into the dining room and telling everyone to get down. Jim fired a shot into the ceiling to display the seriousness of his demand. One employee tried to run out the back door, but he was jammed shut. As that employee ran toward the counter, Jim shot him once, but not fatally. He told him to get into the walk-in freezer, and then he told Dick to get into the freezer as well. Once they were in, Jim approached the door and shot them both fatally. Juan and Jim proceeded to empty the registers, but that wasn't all they had come for. Another employee tried to escape out the back door, but it was no use. Jim forced more of the employees into the freezer. Then they demanded that Lynn open the safe. Once it was open, Juan used the knife to cut her throat, which was also not fatal. They grabbed the cash from the safe, which brought their take to between $1,800 and $1,900. Neither of them wore masks, and since it was definite that they would be recognized, they likely pre-planned to kill everyone who was there. They dragged Lynn into the freezer with the other 6 people who had been in the restaurant that evening, 4 alive, 2 already executed. Shots rang out until everyone in the freezer was dead. Every source says that they used a .38 caliber revolver, but some sources claim they went around and collected all the shell casings, which they wouldn't have needed to do with a revolver. With a revolver, the shell casings remain in the gun after the bullet is fired. There were a total of 21 shots fired, which means they would have needed to reload 4 or 5 times depending on the capacity of the weapon. It was more than likely they collected the spent casings into their pocket instead of just emptying them onto the floor when they reloaded. After the murders, Jim and Juan used a mop to clean up some of the blood, more importantly removing any footprints they had made in the blood. They locked the doors to the restaurant and turned off the power at the breaker. That caused the analog clocks to stop at 9:48 p.m. After they left, they changed their clothes and put the dirty clothes in a dumpster. Then they drove out to Carpentersville and tossed the gun, the knife, and the shell casings into the Fox River. After disposing of all the evidence, they drove to a grocery store, parked Juan's car, and called a friend named Eileen Bacala for a ride. She picked them up and they immediately told her what they had just done. Not seeming to care that her friends were criminals, they all went to her house and hung out. Jim counted out the money and split it between himself and Juan, giving Eileen $50 for her help. She would go on to purchase a new pair of shoes with that blood money. The following day, they picked up Juan's car and took it to a car wash to make sure it was clean of anything that could even remotely connect them to the crime. The restaurant was closing when Jim and Juan carried out the murder, so by the time 10 p.m. rolled around and the employees weren't showing up back home, their families began getting concerned. 16-year-old Michael Castro's parents waited until 11 p.m. before his father, Manny, got in his car and headed to the restaurant. He saw his son's car in the parking lot, but the building was locked up and dark. He thought that maybe Michael's car had broken down and he got a ride with someone else. He and his wife started driving around looking for him. At 1:30 in the morning, Beatrice Maldonado was also concerned about her husband Lupe not having arrived home. She had her brother drive out to the restaurant where he saw Lupe's car in the parking lot. At the same time, a police cruiser pulled up and asked him what he was doing. The man explained what was going on, but the officer brushed him off and told him to go home. As more and more people began to realize that their family members had not come home from work, eventually calls were made to the police and an officer was sent to check it out. When Officer Ron Conley arrived at Brown's Chicken at 3:11 a.m., Manny Castro had returned to the restaurant. The officer walked around the back of the building and pulled the handle on the door, which opened right up. As he looked into the dark kitchen with his flashlight, he immediately noticed a mop that looked like it had blood on it. He called for backup, and as soon as another officer arrived, they began their search of the establishment. They moved forward through the kitchen with their guns drawn until they came to a walk-in freezer, which was ajar. As they cautiously pulled the door open, they were faced with the horror of 7 dead bodies piled inside. After clearing the rest of the building, they radioed in what they had found, and soon the parking lot was filled with emergency vehicles. The bodies were tangled together in the freezer and had to be inspected and removed individually, so the last body didn't leave the scene until after 6 p.m. that day. The entire restaurant was dusted for prints, of which there were many, but the perpetrators had been careful not to have left any. Though they mopped up the footprints that had been left in blood, they left footprints in other parts of the establishment. Even if your shoes seem clean, they can leave faint prints in the dust on the ground. Investigators also collected the garbage, which there wasn't much of since the store was about to close. It seemed that the garbage had been recently taken out when Juan threw out the meal he had ordered just before the attack. The chicken he had taken a bite out of was collected, and eventually DNA would be collected from the bite, though in 1993 it wasn't nearly enough to be used for a DNA match. Still, hoping it may be useful somehow, it was saved, and it would be that forward thinking that would ultimately help get justice for the victims. The last charge on the register was for a meal purchased at 9:08 p.m. that matched the food found in the garbage. Nothing that was found on the scene would lead to a suspect, so investigators relied on a few tips to try and bring the killer to justice. One tip pointed a finger at Martin Blake, a former employee who had been fired only a week before the murders. Martin had worked at Brown's Chicken before the Ehlenfelds had purchased it, but he wasn't a model employee. On New Year's Eve, he left work 2 hours early to attend a party, and the following morning was fired over the phone by Rick. People said he was upset about it and was known to have a gun, so police raced to his house and took him into custody. He was interrogated about his whereabouts the previous evening, why he had been fired, and where he kept his guns. His clothes were taken and tested for blood, and he was given a polygraph, which he passed. When they searched his house, they didn't find anything related to the robbery or the murders. They found his gun, which was a .22 caliber, not matching the weapon used in the crime. Eventually, Martin's family hired a lawyer who went to the police and demanded they let him go if they weren't able to charge him with a crime. The police released him as there was no evidence that he had been involved, but the damage in the media was already done. The news had made many reports, a few of them completely fabricated, about Martin, his criminal record, and his likely guilt. After being released by the police, he retreated to his father's house to try and escape the barrage of reporters before moving out of the state. When Anne was released from the psychiatric facility on January 25th, she tried to go back to her regular life, which meant continuing to date Jim. It was only a few days after her release that she went to Jim's house, where he and Juan told her exactly what had happened at Brown's Chicken the evening of January 8th. Anne had kept the newspaper article about the murders and had written about the call from Jim in her journal, and now her suspicions were confirmed. She tucked that information away, but it wasn't long before Jim wanted her to get involved. The only thing investigators had to go on was that it seemed like the killer or killers were familiar with the layout of the restaurant. They began interviewing all of the employees and former employees of the business. Juan was called in early February and asked to come into the police station for an interview. Jim told Anne that she needed to go with Juan to the interview and pretend to be his girlfriend. She couldn't be his alibi because she was in the hospital at the time, but they could present themselves as a happy couple to make the investigators less suspicious of Juan. At the station, Juan answered questions about his job at the restaurant. He had been hired a few months after the Ehlenfelds bought the place, and he quit a few months later, saying he had simply found a better paying job. They asked if he had any issues with anyone who worked there, and he said no. Many of the employees were his friends. They took his fingerprints, got a DNA sample, and let him go, with nothing in his interview standing out as suspicious. He claimed he had been with an ex-girlfriend that night, who was really just Eileen, who agreed to back up his story. Juan's interview was just like every other person who was interviewed, and with no suspects, the investigation went cold. Anne and Jim would eventually break up, and Anne would keep her distance, always remembering the threats from Jim that he would kill her if she ever told anyone about the Brown's Chicken murders. Anne kept that promise until 1997, when the Brown's Chicken case appeared on the television show America's Most Wanted. She saw the episode, and when it was over, she wrote a letter containing the information she knew about the crime and mailed it to the address given on the show. The letter would get lost in a sea of other tips, but around then, investigators thought they had already found their man. Paul Dennis Reed would go on to be known as the fast food killer, and when he was finally arrested in 1997, investigators were hopeful that he had also carried out the murders at Brown's 4 years earlier. He had committed robberies and murders at 3 restaurants in the Nashville area where he had made his victims get into the freezer. He had been in prison for armed robbery in Texas in the 80s, but was released on parole in 1990. Then he fled the state. The timeline and the way he committed his crimes fit, and Paul wore the same size shoes as the prints taken from the scene. But there was no evidence that he had committed the murders or had even been in Palatine in January of 1993. By 2002, Anne had made a habit of telling people she knew not to give out her information. She told friends and family to say they didn't know, claim they had lost touch, or whatever they needed to do to keep her information a secret. That was due to the fear she had that Jim may still want to silence her. It was made easier by the fact that, in the mid-1990s, she bought a trailer and began traveling around the U.S. working outdoor adventure jobs. After a few years, she settled back down in central Illinois and got a degree. She had never heard back regarding the letter to America's Most Wanted, and she was having a hard time dealing with knowing what she did about the Brown's chicken murders. She was also worried that she might get in trouble for accompanying Juan to the police station for his interview, so she wanted to write an anonymous letter to the police. But a friend convinced her to go in person, and after making a few calls to guarantee she wouldn't get into trouble, she agreed. On March 25, 2002, Anne met with a detective at the Palatine Police Department and told him everything she knew about Jim and Juan's involvement in what had become known as the Brown's Chicken Massacre. After a few weeks of checking the info she had against the details of the crime, investigators felt confident that Anne was telling the truth. They asked her if she would call Jim and try to get him to talk about the murders on tape. She agreed, but with Jim on the phone, he wouldn't say anything. When she said the police were asking about the Brown's chicken murders and asked what she should tell them, he played dumb. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said on the recording. Investigators had tried and failed to get Jim to incriminate himself, but that wasn't their only move. They had more to work with. Anne told them that Eileen Bacala had also known about the murders and had picked them up after it happened. Investigators brought her in for an interview, and after securing immunity for having taken the money, she too opened up about what she knew about Jim and Juan's involvement. At the same time, forensic technicians pulled the evidence from the crime out of storage and focused on the piece of chicken that had a bite taken out of it. In 2002, DNA technology had advanced to where a full profile could be pulled from a small amount of saliva. The technicians did just that, and when they ran it against the suspects that had been interviewed in 1993, there was a match. Juan Luna. With direct evidence, authorities secured an arrest warrant for Juan and set up surveillance on his home in Carpentersville, the same place they had driven to toss the weapons into the river. On May 16, 2002, Juan left his home at about 3 p.m. with his 4-year-old son. Just down the road, he stopped at a gas station, and once out of his vehicle, officers surrounded him and placed him under arrest. A detective went to Indiana the same day and waited for Jim to arrive at work. He asked Jim to come with him back to Illinois for further questioning in the Brown's chicken murders, and Jim agreed. Jim and the detective sat in the back seat as another officer drove north. It wasn't long before Jim admitted he was involved. He said, quote, "I'm surprised it took you this long." Jim knew he had been caught, but he still downplayed his involvement in the murders. He told the detective that he had just helped control the employees. It was Juan who had killed most of them. He claimed he killed a couple that Juan wouldn't kill. Juan told investigators everything that had happened on the night of January 8, 1993. He spent a total of 19 hours explaining his knowledge of the restaurant, that it would be almost empty at 9 p.m., that there were no cameras and there were no alarms. He detailed exactly how each person died, each gunshot, as well as the slice to Lynn's throat. He told them exactly what each person said as they were being executed. It was like the crime had festered in his head for the last 10 years, playing over and over, keeping the memory fresh in his mind. Jim also confessed to the crimes, though trying to claim he committed less murders, but he did confess. Of course, both of them would take back their confessions and claim they were coerced by the time they went to trial. Juan originally tried to hire a private attorney, but after he ran out of money, he started using a public defender. He claimed that his confession was coerced and that detectives threatened to deport his parents if he didn't confess. First, the confession was recorded, and it wasn't coerced. Juan willingly confessed, and while he did, the investigators gave him pizza and water, then later gave him soda. He wasn't being abused, and he wasn't being fed information. Second, his DNA was at the scene, so he was definitely there. He didn't argue that he had just eaten there before they closed. He claimed he wasn't there. It was clearly a lie. Juan's trial took years to finally start because the judge was in an accident and they had to delay while he recovered. There were also a lot of legal tricks pulled by the lawyers to try and put their client in a better position, and those take time. Juan's lawyer tried to get his confession tape thrown out, claiming it was coerced, but since the tape itself showed it wasn't, the judge denied the motion. When the trial finally started in 2007, the prosecutor had pretty solid evidence: DNA, a recorded confession, and 2 witnesses. They played the confession and had both Anne and Eileen testify. The defense claimed the DNA had been mishandled, still maintained that the confession was coerced, and picked apart the witness testimonies. They made sure to make the jury know that both Anne and Eileen had a history of drug use. He asked Eileen if she heard and saw things that weren't there when she got high, to which she answered no. He was basically trying to say that Eileen had imagined Jim and Juan's story of committing the crime while she was high, on marijuana, which she only referred to as reefer during the entire trial. So that probably gives you a sense of how much he knew about the effects of marijuana. And that imagined story perfectly matched the evidence from the scene. That would only happen if Eileen was psychic, not high. He was equally as relentless about Anne's drug use as well, but she had a history of taking heavier hallucinogens like LSD and PCP. She admitted that she had seen hallucinations while on drugs, but his suggestion still meant that she would have had to have hallucinated the exact details from the scene, which again is unlikely. And then the 2 women would have had to have hallucinated the exact same thing at different times, which is impossible. After a 6-week trial, the jury found Juan Luna guilty of 7 first-degree murders, and since it was a death penalty case, they moved on to the sentencing phase of the trial. Victim impact statements were read by the families of the victims, and statements about Juan were given by his loved ones. When Rick and Lenny Linfeld's daughter, Joyce, described her father and told Juan he owed her an apology for taking him away from her, the defendant broke down into tears. It was a sign of the guilt he felt for his own actions, the behavior of a guilty man. The jury voted against the death penalty based on a single holdout, so Juan Luna was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jim's trial was next, and the evidence against him wasn't as strong. There was no DNA, and his confession wasn't as detailed. His confession, though, like Juan's, showed no abuse or coercion. Here, though, the gun used in the crime matched the one Jim had purchased from his friend. It was a Smith & Wesson .38 caliber revolver that he had stolen from another friend's mother. Testimony showed that it had been sold to Jim, and others saw Jim with the gun until the time of the murders, when it never appeared again. After that, along with the testimonies of Anne and Eileen, James Degorski was found guilty of 7 counts of first-degree murder. He was also eligible for the death penalty, and after another round of victim impact statements and testimony from Jim's family, only 10 jurors were willing to vote for execution, and Jim was also sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After the massacre, Brown's Chicken struggled to shake the stigma of the tragedy. They tried various marketing campaigns, but in 2009, after Juan and Jim were finally convicted of the crimes, the company filed for bankruptcy and was sold. There are currently only 22 locations remaining, all in Illinois. The Palatine Brown's Chicken closed after the murders and became a dry cleaning business for the remainder of the millennium. The building was demolished in 2001, and a Chase Bank was built in the spot, which remains to this day. Before we finish this episode, I just want to remind you that we're trying to hit 1 million subscribers this year, so before you go, take a minute to subscribe to the channel. Even better, tell someone else about the channel so they can subscribe as well. Then make sure you both turn on notifications so you'll always know when a new episode airs. You can also support the channel by checking out our merch at thisismonsters.com. A link is in the description. Your support is appreciated. Though Jim Degorski was not abused in any way during his confession, he was physically assaulted when he got to Cook County Jail to await trial. During intake, a sheriff's deputy asked him a question, and Jim responded with, quote, "Fuck you." So the deputy punched him twice in the face. Jim ended up with a cut lip and a broken cheekbone that required multiple surgeries, but at the time he lied to a guard supervisor saying he slipped and hit his face on the toilet. He would later say he wanted to avoid further conflict, but in 2004 he reported the incident. The deputy was acquitted of aggravated battery charges, so Jim sued him, a jail guard that was there at the time, and the sheriff. The case was suspended during the murder trial, but in 2014 he won his case and was awarded $451,000 in compensatory and punitive damages. It's unclear how much of the money actually went to Jim, though, as most convicts owe money after their trials. Many of the families of Juan and Jim's victims said the judgment felt like a slap in the face, but others said that it's important to protect everyone's civil rights, no matter their criminal history. You can let me know how you feel about the judgment in the comments. The 1993 Brown's Chicken Massacre was a mystery that lasted almost a decade and was thought by some like it would never be solved. Two young men decided that the lives of 7 people were disposable so they could pocket a few $100 each. Then they went their separate ways and lived their lives like nothing had ever happened. If they hadn't told the story to 2 people in the days after it happened, they might have never gotten caught. But like most selfish monsters, they couldn't help but brag, and now they'll never experience freedom. Thanks for watching This Is Monsters. New episodes are uploaded twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays. There are occasional bonus episodes covering unsolved cases and criminal history. If you have a suggestion for a case you think I should cover, leave it in the comments. You can always follow the channel on Instagram at thisis_monsters and purchase merch at thisismonsters.com. Thanks so much, and be safe.